So we now come to the start of our first session on ethics and policy. So I'll just wait a moment for all of you to find your seats before we start to invite our speakers on. So while we're taking our seats, this session aims to update researchers on the ethical and legal considerations, as well as the implications surrounding data sharing and data analysis of an individual's genetic and genomic information. We'd also like to draw your attention to one of the highlights of today's event. For this session, we will be using a real-time web-based application known as Pigeonhole Live. Okay, some of you might have used this before, where you can post and vote for questions using your smartphone, your tablet, or your laptop, or all of the above if you like. Please participate in the Q&A by logging in to pigeonhole.at. That's pigeonhole.at, and key in the password PIC24, okay, PIC24. You may send in your questions, or you can vote for existing questions that have already been submitted, and this information can be found on the LED screens here as well. All right, so without further ado, we would like to invite our first speaker, Professor Julian Savulescu, Chen Sulan Centennial Professor in Medical Ethics and Director for the Center for Biomedical Ethics at the Yong Lu Lin School of Medicine at the National University of Singapore. Professor Savulescu will share with us on the topic entitled Polygenic Risk Scores and Reproduction, Ethical, Legal, and Social Issues. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thanks very much. So how should we form policy in ethically controversial areas related to genomics? I picked this topic for several reasons. First of all, the Bioethics Advisory Committee is currently doing an update on guidance related to genomics, and polygenic risk scores are a part of that review. But more importantly, in my 26 years in this field, this is the most intellectually interesting area. And thirdly, it gives me an opportunity to talk about a novel methodology that we are pioneering here in Singapore called Collective Reflective Equilibrium, that in a project starting in November, we will apply to more germane questions such as return of findings, carrier screening, models of consent, relevant to the National Precision Medicine Initiative. What are polygenic risk scores? Polygenic risk scores are quantitative estimates of an individual's disposition to developing disease based on the cumulative effect of gene variants and associations. So most of the diseases that we'll suffer from have polygenic contributions. So really the future of genomics, as Professor Dame Sue Hill mentioned briefly, is not really in monogenic diseases, it's going to be in polygenic predictions. And polygenic predictions can predict disposition to diabetes, heart disease, and can be used in population screening to refine risks for individuals undergoing genetic testing, can guide therapeutic interventions, facilitate diagnosis, and so on. But interestingly, they've also been used recently in the reproductive context, and this is the more controversial use. So polygenic risk scores have been marketed as a part of the IVF process. This allows prospective parents to select embryos based on their risks of disease. So genomic prediction, for example, creates a health index of embryos based on their polygenic scores for a variety of diseases such as schizophrenia, heart disease, diabetes, depression, and so on, and estimates the impact of that increased risk in terms of quality adjusted life years over the life of that individual, and ranks the embryos. And Aurea was the first child born through this process in the United States for genetic selection using polygenic risk scores. But I'm going to talk not today about using it for diseases, though many of the same arguments will apply. I'm going to use it for non-disease traits, because not only do genes contribute to diseases, they contribute to traits that human beings value, such as intelligence, empathy, pro-social behaviour, and even sexual orientation, as I'll discuss presently. And indeed, Genomic Prediction and other companies are aware of this, and initially Stephen Hsu, the head of genomic prediction said that the public will want genomic predictions for height and intelligence. And indeed, they offered tests for low normal intelligence initially, but withdrew it because of public reaction or professional reaction. So one of the areas that polygenic scores have been developed for are the predictions of educational attainment as a proxy for intelligence. And roughly, behavioural genetics has revealed about 15% of the variance in intelligence. Roughly 50% of intelligence has a genetic contribution, and it's estimated that polygenic scoring could predict up to 25% of variance in intelligence. And as I mentioned, this could be used today, not just to screen for intellectual disability with a polygenic contribution, but also for predictions in the range of normality. Now, there are many limitations, which I'm sure you're familiar with polygenic risk scoring. This is not a talk about the science of polygenic risk scoring. I'm not suggesting we should implement this now. What I want to do is establish a framework for thinking about this as the science matures. So I won't go through all of the limitations. There are also interpretive and selective challenges. So I now want to talk about one aspect of collective reflective equilibrium, which I'll describe in a moment, but which involves seeing what the public think about these sorts of technologies. So I'm going to use the example of predictions of educational attainment. So this study came out in Science last year, and sorry, it's hard for me to see these slides from this distance. I thought we would have them here. But you have two of the big heavyweights of polygenic scores there, Dan Benjamin and Patrick Turley. And so they did the following study in the United States of a US population of the public's views. And they asked people what they thought of a service which would increase the likelihood of getting into a top 100 college in the US from 3% to 5%, assuming that 1 in 10 people are using that service, okay? And they asked about the moral acceptability of this and also about their own personal willingness to use the service. And so you can see here, there's no pointer here, but in terms of SAT preparation, as you'd expect, more than 3/4 were willing to use the service. And as you would expect, people with more education were more willing to use it, and younger people were more willing to use it. Not very surprising. But in the US, 41% of people were willing to use gene editing of an embryo to get a 2% increase in the chance of their child entering a top 100 college. And 48% were willing to use PGTP, polygenic testing using polygenic risk scores. So nearly half of the people were willing in the US to use this. And how morally acceptable was it? Well, if you just concentrate on the morally wrong category, only about 30% of people in the US outright thought it was morally wrong to use gene editing for this. It's pretty surprising, really. Admittedly, only around 25% thought it was definitely morally right, but in terms of moral opposition, only about 1/3 of people were opposed to it. PGT, or polygenic risk score, using polygenic risk scores for selection, only about less than 20% thought it was morally wrong. So I was quite struck by this. So we thought, why don't we see what Singaporeans think? Okay, so, and I'm sure you can predict Singaporeans will be even more enthusiastic about this. So in terms of embryo selection service, the willingness to use it, 60% were willing to use embryo selection. Nearly 50% were willing to use gene editing, assuming it's safe, of course, there's no off-target mutations, etc., etc. Okay, now what about the moral acceptability? Again, if you just concentrate on morally wrong, only 31% thought that gene editing was morally wrong, and only 20% thought that PGTP was morally wrong, which is actually higher than in the US. And if we stratify this by household income and the same sorts of effects that you saw in the US, that the higher household income were, the more supportive you were of both selection and editing. And by ethnicity, as some of you may predict, the Chinese subpopulation were statistically significantly more interested in gene editing than the other subpopulations. We haven't done a study in China, but we will be doing a study in China, and my prediction is these results are going to be significantly more enthusiastic than Singapore. Interestingly, the Malay subpopulation more interested in embryo selection. Religion only had an effect to reduce enthusiasm for gene editing, but not for embryo selection. So the picture you're getting here is Singaporean public very accepting of genetic selection for a very small increment in the ability to get into a top 10, a top 100 college. So here are the most salient differences between the US. You can see that 58% of the Singaporean public have a greater than 50% willingness to use this compared to a 38% proportion of the US public. And 40% thought it was morally acceptable in Singapore, whereas only 27% in the US. So Singapore, very different, and statistically different to the US. Okay, so that's one part of the issue. I mean, what do the public think? Public are supportive, but that doesn't mean we should employ this. So what's the second part? Well, we need to employ ethical theories, concepts, and principles. So what are the ethical considerations around using polygenic scores for something like educational attainment, intelligence, in reproduction? Well, one important principle is the principle of procreative autonomy, that people should make their own decisions about the children that they have. Not the state, that was eugenic, it's individuals. And this is supportive of allowing access to this kind of testing. Most importantly, this testing would not be allowed in most jurisdictions outside of the US. Australia, the UK, Singapore would not allow polygenic risk scoring of embryos, okay, during IVF. I'm going to argue that that's wrong, okay? The basic principle for restricting people's liberty in a liberal society is called the harm principle. It's where the restriction of liberty is necessary to prevent harm to another defined individual. Now, there are two kinds of testing, which I've described as incidental and non-incidental, or supplementary or non-supplementary. So if you're having PGT for other reasons, look for chromosomal abnormalities, look for single gene disorders, the testing has already been done. Adding polygenic scoring to that adds no additional possible risk to the embryo. So it can't be that you can prevent PGT-P, which is additional to other testing on basis of prevention of harm. The only real ground for preventing PGT-P is if embryo biopsy imposes an additional risk to the embryo and the future child, for example, damaging the embryo. And that applies to PGT-A, PGT-M, and indeed all pre-implantation genetic testing. Now, if PGT is safe enough, then this harm-based argument is not a ground for restricting people from accessing testing. There's an issue in reproduction of selection in embryos, which is philosophically very interesting, very complex, but the nub of it is that harm-based considerations very rarely provide a ground for restriction of selection because the child owes their existence to the selection procedure. It's not as if they could have been better. That individual could have been better if a different embryo had been selected. So very, very weak reasons to impose legislation restricting PGT. Gene editing is different because that can impose mutations on an embryo that makes that individual's life go better or worse. Selection is different because it involves selecting between different individuals. So we've recently discussed the implications of this in relationship to embryo research. It means that a lot of embryo research that does not involve risk to future children should be really just like tissue research. So this is a basic point, but safety is what's important when it comes to regulation. So if PGT is safe, then there's no reason to regulate it. Issues of effectiveness are important, not to safety and not to regulation directly, but to distributive justice, how we use public funds. So whether the government decides to fund PGT, that's a separate issue to whether you allow people to buy it privately. And secondly, to informed consent. And one of the big issues here is making sure that people understand the limitations of the technology, that is, just the limitations on its effectiveness. But that's not a ground to ban it as it is currently in Singapore. Okay, so justice is about allocating resources, usually to bring about the most good or to give priority to the worst off or to provide equity of access. And that's an important issue about whether PGTP should be publicly funded. That will turn on its cost effectiveness. There are, of course, the usual concerns about eugenics, discrimination and design of babies, which I won't go into. The interesting thing about polygenic risk scores is pleiotropy. So pleiotropy is the phenomenon that genes can have multiple effects. So I'll go through an example of pleiotropy in a moment, but with respect to intelligence, higher scores for intelligence also associated with higher risk of autism spectrum disorders. So genes come in packages that imply increased risks in one area but reduce risks in another. And this will be a difficult feature to take into account when implementing polygenic scoring in reproduction and clinical medicine. So I want to talk about one of the most interesting examples of pleiotropy. It's a polygenic risk score developed for same-sex behaviour. People who have sexual encounters with people of the same sex at some point in their life. So this paper came out in Nature Human Behaviour, when was it? In 2021, during the pandemic, and I was asked to write a commentary on it, where Zeitz and colleagues developed a polygenic score to predict same-sex behaviour. There's my commentary. And again, I won't go through this in great detail. There were reasons to explain why same-sex behaviour persisted, given its apparent evolutionary disadvantage. And what they found was, they used the UK Biobank and 23andMe to develop this score. So we heard about the UK Biobank. It also is providing information about non-disease traits. What they found was there was a significant and positive correlation with same-sex behaviour, people reporting that they had at least one instance of it, with the lifetime number of opposite sex partners in people who were predominantly engaged in opposite sex behaviour, so heterosexuals, for both men and women. So if you had were high on this polygenic score and you were a male, you were more likely to have more female partners in your life. So this apparently explained the sort of paradox, the Darwinian paradox of why this disposition progressed. But also, it was also importantly associated with risk-taking and openness to experience, as well as charisma and reported attractiveness and a number of other characteristics. This is the pleiotropic effect. So you've got this, so if you like genes for homosexuality, but also means genes for more partners, more openness to experience, more risk-taking. So what do we do about things like intelligence and scores for homosexuality? Okay, how should we regulate this? So on one view, the American approach, the laissez-faire approach, there's no harm, direct harm to people from doing this, so we should allow it. However, we've pioneered this approach of employing collective reflective equilibrium, which means bringing ethical theories together with public opinion to develop policy. So I just wanted to kind of test out how this might apply to this case in the last 3 minutes. We've also been using this novel platform that Edmund Awad has developed for us to ascertain the public's attitudes to large numbers of conditions besides same-sex behaviour and intelligence to see what the public do think. And a while ago, we proposed a different model to the disease model, which Singapore and Australia and the UK employ, and the laissez-faire or libertarian model. We call it the welfarist model, which says that we should look at the association of these traits with the impact on people's well-being. And this could be their own well-being or the well-being of others. And this is supported by theories such as utilitarianism and contractualism. Don't have time to explain the link there. But let's consider how this might apply to something like regulating through collective reflective equilibrium 3 non-disease traits: intelligence, same-sex behaviour, and antisocial behaviour. We've also looked at antisocial behaviour. People care just as much about avoiding a disposition to antisocial behaviour in their children as they do to avoiding heart disease. And I can just describe that data when we come to the end. So what are the effects on the well-being of the package of dispositions involved in each of these traits. So when it comes to intelligence, again, this is controversial. We could spend a talk on this. However, there is evidence that it promotes people's well-being and the well-being of others. For example, people who have higher IQ, more cooperative. And there's public support. So yes, on that count, we should allow it. Theory and opinion converge. Same-sex behaviour. No obvious increment or decrement in terms of the well-being of self, no obvious increment or decrement on the well-being of others, and we don't know what the public will say about that. We haven't got those results yet, but not a strong case for allowing that. Antisocial personality, reduction in well-being of the individual, reduction in well-being of others. Public are strongly against it. My colleague from China just sent me a news item from last month. A woman aborted a baby with XYY on the basis that she believed and was falsely advised that it would become a criminal. And 150,000 people responded, almost all supporting that, saying that the child was born evil. So it does matter to people what the dispositions are, and if there are robust scores for antisocial behaviour, that I think will be a candidate for inclusion in what should be offered. So I've tried to quickly survey one of the most controversial areas in genomics. I've shown you how striking public attitudes can be around those controversial areas, and I've tried to bring, in a very rudimentary and superficial way, two ethical approaches based on welfarist or well-being considerations to give you a sketch of how we might think about regulating. Now, this is just the beginning of a beginning. As I said, we're doing a platform to survey millions of preferences on these topics, and we've yet to integrate the results into philosophical and ethical theories. But that, I think, is what we need to do in order to form policies in these controversial areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Savulescu, for your sharing. The next speaker I'd like to invite on is Dr. Angela Ballantyne, Associate Professor of Bioethics for the University of Otago. Dr. Ballantyne will be sharing on diversity, representation, and bias in precision medicine. Dr. Ballantyne, please.
So kia ora. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to get to speak to you. So I'm going to talk about diversity and bias and representation in precision medicine, and I'm going to take it that you're all well aware of the global sense of urgency regarding ensuring that our genomic data sets accurately represent different populations. So quickly, people of European genetic ancestry account globally for about 16% of the population, but if you look at the genomes that are in GWASs, so genetic-wide association studies, people of European descent account for about 83% of all genomes. So that's one of the motivations for establishing the National Precision Medicine Program in Singapore, is to try and provide a leading reference data set of Asian genomes. Now, given we kind of accept that sense of urgency now, it's interesting to look back to 2000, June in 2000, when the announcement of the first human genome sequence was announced. There was a press conference at the White House, and President Clinton, Prime Minister Tony Blair, Francis Collins, Craig Venter from Celera Genomics. And one of the key narratives of that press conference was that the human genome shows, the sequencing of the human genome shows there are no differences between racial groups. So that was a very strong narrative 25 years ago, and it's interesting to see how far we've shifted from that perspective now in terms of thinking about the priority of sequencing diverse genomes. Now, for clarity, there's a few different terms that are sometimes used in this space. Race refers to distinct and shared physical traits between certain groups. Ethnicity refers to shared cultural or linguistic or national attributes. Both of those are essentially socially constructed concepts. There's no biological definition of race. And then genetic ancestry refers to the origins of a specific genetic population. When we look at a lack of diversity in the current data sets, they're driven by two key things. The first is economic constraints. So certain low and middle income countries simply don't have the economic resources to establish their own genomic data sets. The second limitation is trust. So even in countries that have the financial resources to establish these data sets, certain marginalised, discriminated, low trust groups participate at lower rates. And so that's going to be primarily what I focus on today. A few key takeaways, because I'm going to cover a lot of ground and sort of pick out different elements, but this is kind of where the talk's going. When we talk about genomic and scientific diversity, it's really important to understand that that conversation is located within a political and social, cultural context. Sometimes we can think about science in a kind of sterile, arbitrary sense, but when we're talking about recruiting and we're talking about trust, that exists within a political conversation. I'm going to talk a bit about power, so the extent to which we can encourage low trust groups to participate in genomic research sometimes requires power sharing. One of the themes that comes out really strongly is transparency. I would almost say radical transparency. And the takeaway here is when you're engaging with low trust populations, at all costs, avoid pitching or selling or advertising genomic research. Relationship and the importance of relationship comes through really strongly, particularly when working with Indigenous communities. And being clear that there are trade-offs. I think sometimes we can think, that we're sort of riding the horse of scientific innovation into the future, and then we sort of look back and realise that these groups that we haven't brought along with us, and we think we can just sort of scoop them up and keep riding at pace. But some of the research shows that if you're really going to engage with low trust populations, that involves time to build those relationships, and it can actually sometimes mean slowing down that research and slowing down some of the utility and benefits we might get out of it. So those are important ethical and political trade-offs we need to consider. So don't think you can have it all. Okay, so when we talk about engaging different groups, there's three different models, and we need to be clear about what we're trying to achieve. Are we trying to achieve benefit sharing? And this essentially just means there's a justice or an equity reason. We want to ensure that our polygenic risk scores, when applied in clinical practice, have equal utility in different populations. And if we don't include diverse populations in the science, the clinical applicability isn't going to be as accurate. Now notice with benefit sharing, those populations can be kind of passive, right? It's about us as the scientific community giving out those benefits. Public and patient involvement is a different philosophy that requires engaging with patients and the publics and bringing them into the conversation. But note that there's a whole range of different activities included here. This can be anything from doing a survey and then deciding to what extent you're going to take account of those public views, all the way through to, as we saw in the UK biobank models, having lay members on decision-making committees like data access committees or IRBs. On the other side, at this end of the spectrum, we can see an example of power sharing. And so having lay members on decision-making committees is an example of that. But I'm going to give you an example from New Zealand that even shows a higher level of power sharing. So this is the Integrated Data Infrastructure Network in New Zealand. It doesn't include genomic data, but it's a phenomenal, very rich data set, including government administrative data, business data, and several long-term cohort studies. In terms of governance of this data set, the original governance model was a 5 safes model, which I think some of you might be familiar with. It's sort of an international model for looking at data access. And that involves a reasonably sort of cursory check of, are the people, the researchers adequately qualified? Is the project in the public interest? Is the data secure? Are we only releasing necessary data? And so forth. So in New Zealand, speaking about specific political social contexts, we had really strong pushback from Māori, our Indigenous population, who are about 18% of the population, who argued that Māori data is a living taonga. Taonga means treasure. It's of strategic value for Māori, and they argued really assertively for data sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is about control, right? This isn't about sharing in the benefits. This is about having control over these data sets. And they argued that that was an inherent right. And those of you coming from Canada or Australia or the US will be familiar with similar Indigenous data sovereignty arguments in those contexts. So Statistics New Zealand developed an entire second layer of review. This was led by Maui Hudson, who's a Māori academic in New Zealand. Sorry, you can only see part of that slide. So this is Ngā Tikanga Pahere. It's a second layer of review, essentially by Māori. It's based on 10 Māori principles of ethics. And this is where we come to trade-off. So on one level, you can think that's fantastic, it's power sharing, it's responding to a low trust community's concerns. But to be fair, researchers in New Zealand do complain that this is a roadblock, right? That it's an extra layer of review, that it's burdensome, and that it's difficult. So I think that's where we really need to be honest about the kind of trade-offs we're making and be sometimes willing to pay that cost. So let's look for a minute to Singapore. And I want to start by talking about some kind of general level trust related data for Singapore. So if you haven't looked at this, this is really an interesting data set. This is the Trust Barometer run by Alderman, a company, and they do global surveys of public trust every year. Now, trust depends on two features. You have to trust that the person is acting in your best interests, they're acting ethically, and you have to believe they're competent. So, I mean, if I'm going to lend my car to Julian, I have to be confident that Julian knows how to drive a car and has a license, and also that he's going to take care of that car, right? He's not planning to rob a bank and use it for a getaway. So trust depends on judging that someone's acting ethically and that they're competent. And the Alderman Trust Barometer looks at trust in 4 main social institutions: governments, business, media, and NGOs. Now, you can see in Singapore in 2021 and 2024 that all of those core institutions are in the high trust quadrant. They're seen as being both ethical and competent. This is really unusual globally. So if you look at the US by comparison, most of those institutions are seen as either unethical or incompetent or both. So Singapore is starting from a very sort of high trust position. Now, the Alderman survey this year was really interesting because it looked specifically at emerging scientific technologies, including genomic-based medicine. One of the questions was, do you trust your government, or do you think that your government lacks the competence to regulate emerging innovations? And you can see Singapore's right down the end here. So Singapore, compared to many of these countries, has very high trust, relatively high trust, in the capacity of its government to regulate scientific innovation. But note that the response rate was still 50, right? So it's still 50-50. So maybe some work to be done there. Do you believe that scientists are able to be transparent and accessible in terms of the work they're doing? Do you think that scientists in your country can communicate with people like you? On this, Singapore's actually at the other end of the spectrum, right? So we had a higher than average number of Singaporeans saying, no. No, we think our scientists need to do more work to communicate to us. Now, this gets a little bit complicated, but it's really important. This is about power and marginalisation. So, do you think that people like me, and that could be people of my ethnicity, of my age, my disability status, my gender, are at the table and controlling how decisions around genomic medicine are made? Or do I think that it's those people over there that are making the decision, and actually people like me are way over here? If people, this is globally, think that there's a big gap, no one like me's at that table, they're much less willing to accept those innovations, including genomic medicine. So that's the kind of background, and now I want to talk a little bit about some of the data we've got from Singapore. So I have had the absolute pleasure and privilege of being involved in research, social science research in Singapore, looking at the development of the National Precision Medicine Program. So I've been involved from about 2020. And I think for those of you who are international guests, this is something that's really unique and very well done in Singapore. And what's been special about this is not just that the Precise and the precision medicine groups have funded the social science research, but it's really been an ongoing conversation with the public. And I feel like the Centre for Biomedical Ethics at the National University of Singapore has been able to facilitate that conversation. It's amazing having Precise tell us what are they worried about in terms of public trust, and then having results back from the public, and then a more nuanced conversation. So that's really been like a two-way process, and it's been very longitudinal, including both qualitative and quantitative data. I'm just, in the last few minutes, going to give you a few snapshots. So relationships are central to trust. And one way of seeing this is in 2020, we asked the public in Singapore, would you be willing to share your data with a precision medicine program? Like that kind of abstract idea of what that would be. Now, you can't have a relationship with an idea, right? So a number of people were still reasonably willing, 64%. But when the National Precision Medicine Program was established, and we 2 years later asked people, would you be willing to share your genomic data with the National Precision Medicine Program? Now it's got a name, it's got an institution. You can watch a video about it. Professor Patrick Tan was part of that video, right? So suddenly there's an identity, a personality attached. We see over 2 years a really remarkable increase in the number of people who are willing to participate. So relationships are central. The other thing we found in Singapore, when we did conjoint analysis studies, and this is where you look at people's reasoning in relation to decisions, and it's useful because sometimes when you ask people, how would you make a decision, that's not the same as how they actually make decisions. So if I said to you, when you go to the supermarket, what's the most important thing in your shopping? You might say, oh, the environmental sustainability of the products. But then when I look at your purchasing power, I see that actually price and brand recognition are what are actually driving your choices. So that's what you're trying to get at with a conjoint analysis survey. So here we found that Singaporeans' willingness to share data is more dependent on knowing who is using the data, and that's about relationship, rather than the purpose of the data sensitivity, or specifically what type of consent was provided. When we looked at trust in government specifically, this is really quite interesting and unusual. So in terms of accessing data, the public was comfortable with many government agencies in Singapore accessing that data, and not a lot of difference in terms of their judgment of those particular government agencies. I like this though, because there's always a little bit of healthy skepticism in Singapore. Singapore is super small, and we trust our own government, no matter what we talk about during elections. But we have our eyes. We have our eyes on them. So it's easier if they're in Singapore, if you want to sue them or you want to catch them red-handed if they're doing something with the data. So a real sense of yes, we trust, but we trust government agencies because they're in Singapore. We also trust organisations that have a Singapore base, but we're a lot more, Singaporeans, more uncomfortable with sharing data overseas. And also, despite high willingness, still some distrust. Actually, I don't trust the government enough. They claimed Trace Together data was only for contract tracing, but ended up sharing it with the police without informing their citizens. And so for those not from Singapore, contract tracing data is the data from collected during COVID. So again, it's just really important to realise when you're going out and thinking about recruiting for a genomic study, you're not doing that in isolation, you're doing it in the political and social context and historical context more broadly. Okay, so now we come to transparency or kind of pitching genomic medicine. It can be really tempting when you're trying to recruit underrepresented groups to go out really hard and pitch all the benefits of genomic medicine. And you guys, you're part of this community, you understand the potential, you see the utility. This was a really great study. I actually wish we'd thought of doing this study, by Anna Middleton. So it was based in the UK, and Professor Middleton had done a lot of work with the Your DNA, Your Say research. So what they found here, so they had 16 focus groups, 100 participants, and they tried different communication strategies. When they went out and emphasised the health benefits, saying something, for example, like, for this research to help everybody, it needs to represent everybody, and that means it needs to include everybody, people from all backgrounds, ethnicities, and walks of life. This seems like a really sensible thing to say to people, right? If you're coming from a low-trust, marginalised social group, this is the kind of response they got. Yeah, I heard everybody. Oh, so what, we can suddenly all help everybody? Okay, now what? Are we admitting there was a point when we weren't being helped, right? That there is this social inequity? Even though, let's talk it as it is, let's be transparent, we've always known there's health inequities. We just don't get the same amount of help and we're not taken seriously. So what this research found is particularly when you're trying to deal with low trust communities, you need to establish relationship and connection first. And you do that effectively by acknowledging their experience and acknowledging why there is distrust, that there is social inequality, right? That maybe there's racism in the health system, that there might have been prior misuse of genomic samples from that community, there might have been prior research harm. And I think about this as flipping from a science-centered perspective, like, let me tell you all the cool things we can do with your data, to a participant-centered perspective, actually let's start with your lived experience. And once you've established that connection, people are much more open to hearing about the benefits of precision medicine. That said, again though, those benefits are best suited if they're very tangible and precise rather than kind of airy-fairy. So this is some preliminary data from recent focus groups in Singapore that emphasise some of these themes, better than I could say it. So, well, what do you really want to use the data for? How does it benefit is one thing, but when we're listening to your benefit, right, from your perspective as scientists. What are the disadvantages to us? If they don't trust you, they'll never trust you regardless of what you say. Even if you let down all the facts, right, explain the benefits, they'll still think, you know, it's fabricated. But if they trust you, they'll trust whatever you say. Okay, so trust comes, establishing that connection comes before trying to pitch the benefits. I believe the whole concept of precision medicine is good, but I think it's the level of transparency that's more worrying for us. If you're giving us information of, you know, like limited transparency and we're having to second guess, I don't think we want to go there. So this is why I say radical transparency and being almost conservative about the promises. If you have a high trust group, a low trust group, they've often been sold a story. They're quite skeptical. So a big sales pitch doesn't often go down very well. Right. Final one. In a way that some people will have more benefits than others. For example, would Li Xianlong get more benefits than me? Let's put out a certain drug specifically designed for him because he's important. Auntie A, Kopitam uncle, okay, never mind, that one's disposable la. I can never do the la authentically, so sorry about that. It's like you'll be creating this new world order. You'll be starting to segregate subtly, so that becomes dangerous. And I think this illustrates really well that idea about how we can sometimes be caught in our own trap of neutrality. So we say, precision medicine, it's about stratifying groups, right, in order to fine-tune prevention and treatment interventions. But when you take that scientific, quite neutral language and put it in a social context, people who are more marginalised or less trusting hear stratification as segregation. That's why you really need to meet people where they're at in terms of their lived experience and their sense of distrust. So in summary, I think it's important to be really clear about whether you're trying to achieve benefit sharing, whether it's an equity and justice justification, whether you're aiming for public and patient involvement and being clear there's a whole range of different activities in there, or whether you're really going for power sharing, and if so, are you prepared to own some of the costs and trade-offs with that? Debates about diversity in genomics are always operating in a political context. Power is important, so people are more willing to accept scientific innovation if people like them are sitting in the control seat. Transparency is important. Don't try to upsell, don't try to spin. Focus on relationships rather than data extraction, and be really explicit about the ethical trade-offs involved. Acknowledgement to the wonderful people I work with in Singapore, both the National University of Singapore team, our external collaborators, our advisory groups, and the many, many participants who have participated in our surveys and focus groups. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ballantyne, for sharing with us your insights, including the importance of building trust in communities. Now, our next speaker to invite is Dr. Michaela Mayrhofer, Head of ELSI, ELSI Services and Research from the European Biobank, and she'll be presenting on the topic, who is ELSA and why does ELSI matter? Can we give a round of applause to welcome Dr. Mayrhofer, please?
Thank you so much for having me. First, who is ELSA and why does ELSI matter? Why did I come up with this title? The title refers to the distinction between ELSI and ELSA. ELSI, ethical, legal, and societal issues coming from the American context, the Genome Project, and in the European context, we needed to do things slightly different, so we called the same thing ELSA. Ethical, legal, and societal aspects. Now, in reality, it doesn't matter. Both things are used interchangeably, and I think that's a good thing, because what matters is the context. Now, I recently went on a website called Unplash and looked up images for ethics work, because ethics work is hard to describe, so what could be better to find an ideal image? And I couldn't. What popped up was the imaginary of a lonely desktop work that is bureaucratic and boring, I would argue. At least that's the images, that it's done by a white male, middle-aged, European, Caucasian, and that it's outsourceable to one single expert. I would even argue it looks very much like a lawyer from the dress code. Now, in practice, however, as you know very well, things are very, very, very different. In practice, there is a lot of seen and unseen ethics work. And with ethics work, I encompass what the European Commission understands by it, that is putting everything that is summed up under ELSI and ELSA together. So it can be the data protection officer, the legal department, so already multiple people, compliance offices in a lot of cases, if the research and the work is done across departments, across countries, across organizations, study nurses, research ethics committees, project managers, local peers, people who have done it for a long time and have become experts simply by doing it over time, and so on and so forth. So it can be the seen work in Europe of GDPR compliance, General Data Protection Regulation. It can be the approved ethics, the favorable ethics vote by a research committee, but it can be also this unseen ethical guidance of an experienced colleague who tells you how things need to be done in a sensitive case, how you consult with an expert, how you start with the relationship work in building it with the patients and research participants that you're dealing with. Or it can be an ELSI work package in a research project that dabs more into the research, into more general things. And then the outcome is a research paper that hopefully then is translated into practice to be meaningful in another way. Now, does an ELSI expert exist? I don't think so. Otherwise, it would be this ugly animal, which in German is called eierlegende Wollmilchsau. This is a drawing of mine where I aimed at it. So it's a pig that produces wool, meat, milk, eggs, all at once, the jack of all trades. And of course, such a jack of all trades, again, does not exist. It's the multitude, the plurality of experts either by profession or experts by practice, and you need both. Then we have the viewpoints of patients. We know that the severity of disease is contrary to the level of concern. So if your disease severity is low, is high, the level of concern is low, and vice versa in a lot of cases. So the depiction also very often is, at least in some of the literature, that there is a patient. And I would argue, again, same as with an ELSI expert, but here much more severe, there is not a patient. There are patients, they are stratified, they see themselves differently. Again, the relational work. We need to take into account this different views and the context also we're operating in within science, and need to understand that of course you can be a patient, a mother, a teacher, all at the same time as well. It's not about it's about diverse identities, not about multiple identities. It's not about contradicting identities. It is the plurality of what is life. You're all those things at the same time. So, of course, one needs to ask, and of course, an opinion can change. And of course, it is about engagement. To what degree? That might, again, differ according to the context. And the same is true for citizens and publics. In the European Union, it's now very fostered and encouraged to ask citizens' viewpoints, to get a citizen representative in a steering committee. Can one person represent all the plurality that there is? There is a little flaw in that. And it's the plural that counts. It's for the citizens, it's for the publics. And if engagement is something you opt for in your governance model, do it right. Don't go for the deficit model in the sense of we know what the other one is thinking, wanting, needing. But aim at building trust and understand that trust is something that you continuously have to work on. Well, we all, or many of us, live in various relationships with, again, our mothers and our partners, our husbands. And, well, of course, my mother did not trust me at a certain point in time when I was 16 years old and telling her I come home at 10 o'clock in the evening, and I didn't show up at 10. I came way past midnight, so obviously I was grounded. And here is the power relation. But I hope with that example I can exemplify what I want to say. It's a dialogue, it's context dependent, it's dependent on time, and it's constantly changing. Now, coming back to the European Union and governance and ethics, the EU considers ethics as including questions of legal and regulatory compliance, as well as questions on moral principles, fundamental rights and values, and how these apply to research activities. It is part of governance that aims to ensure the protection of rights in interests of all those affected by research and related activities, respect for fundamental EU values and human rights, and the EU-funded research is not misused. And here, the EU, as a funder, has not only a carrot, but a quite powerful stick. It has the money. It says, if you want the money, these are the rules that you have to adhere to. When we think of key elements of biobank governance, then those are not different from the wider ethical principles, the principles of research integrity that many of us follow. Accountability, transparency, respect, proportionality, equality, and non-discrimination. And with coherence, effectiveness, openness, participation, and again, accountability, those are implemented in governance, which is, from the ethical side, one building block for what we are doing, whether scientific research or setting up an IT database, all comes together and is then ethical, or could then mean ethical oversight, legal compliance, transparency and accountability, data and sample management, access and sharing policies, such as a local access committee, public engagement or public engagements. For kids, it's different than for adults and so on and so forth. And constant trust building. Simply setting up those rules is already trust building, but also to ask what else should be needed. Now, when we look into further into ELSI and risks, especially in, say, a regular EU project that starts with the proposal phase, then, if granted, the project itself, and then the aftermath, the continuation until the project is really finished off. If you do not take those things into account that are under the wide range of ethical requirements, then you will have lower quality of results. You may have delay in delivery, not only because an ethics vote comes in late, but also because everything is interconnected with each other. You might have higher costs, you might have a mismatched timeline, the reputational risk. So if you do everything by the book, but do not communicate it so that the other, or the audience you want to reach, or you have to reach, does not understand it, then there was something overlooked and a flaw in the system. And very often it's the unavailability of experts that are not around the corner. The hard thing very often, same as in a partnership, is to find the right one. In that sense, what is it what you want to build? You want to build a house, then you need an architect, but not alone. You need a construction worker, you need a plumber, and so on and so forth. And the same is also here for research. One needs to figure out, and very often, while doing it, those are the additional experts, plural, and expertises that we might need, either by buying them in, but also by building them up, so to have them in-house at our not disposal, but at hand. And to give one example of this is consent. Consent is, of course, something we have to do, we should do. At the same time, it has equally to be meaningful. And the example of Amazon's terms and conditions, and I will not ask you to raise your hands who has actually read it, because reading Amazon's terms and conditions alone out loud would take approximately 9 hours, and I'm sure everyone has done that. So if we are not doing that with Amazon, with Google, with WhatsApp, whatever we're using, how can we very often assume that patients, citizens carefully read all this? And it's also not assumed very often that they do, but that they are informed. So the form itself is only one element in building the trust, in fulfilling the form, in asking for consent. So if there is a video that explains how it is done, that allows to make the judgment call for the patient, saying, yeah, that's fine. Or I trust the institution, I've done it before, I don't need to read it again. There are multiple ways. I guess you see where I'm heading with this. And why I put the con in consent is to indicate that very often we tend to overthink it, especially we now as ethical experts. And in combination with legal experts, where the ethical experts very often say, okay, those principles are in, the text is fine, and then legal colleagues come in, but the liability is not covered, so we have to go more into detail. And then we have, in research, a consent form that is up to 42 pages. And that is an impossibility, or should be an impossibility in practice. And it is if patients or the audience for whom it is intended are brought in and say, well, here and there, this does not make sense, let's change it. Now, coming back to ELSI, ELSA, and introducing a new term, responsible research and innovation, these are additional or complementary ways of thinking of the broad social, societal, economic, political, environmental impact of scientific research. And I would argue that the difference between or the complementary aspect of RRI, responsible research and innovation, is that it takes ELSI, ELSA, again, from the academic side down to the practical, even though it's a horrible acronym. It reminds us that research, scientific advancements, ethical studies, and studies on ethics need to be done continuously and all the time. It's always a moving target, always something that we have to look at constantly at all time. It has to be an intrinsic part of governance. It's never finished. It's always something that has to be mended, adapted, again, similar to a house. It involves multiple actors, from data protection experts to patients to the public at large, and it's always relational. And I would like to conclude my presentation with just one image that is, I'm Austrian, and this is a glacier in the Austrian mountains. And with an experienced guide, with the right equipment, you can go anywhere and have a beautiful view to boot. So thank you for having me here in Singapore. It's equally beautiful.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mayrhofer, for sharing us on ELSI and ELSA. Can I invite you to take your seat at the panel? And can I also invite the other speakers from our session 1 to take their seats on stage for the discussion? That will be Professor Julian Savulescu, Dr. Mayrhofer, and Dr. Ballantyne. Can I invite 3 of you to be on stage for this discussion? Our moderator for this panel is Professor Nicki Tiffin, Deputy Director for the South African National Bioinformatics Institute, University of the Western Cape. So to all of you here, please do participate in the Q&A session by using Pigeonhole Live and log into pigeonhole.at, that's pigeonhole.at, and key in your password PIC24, and you can send in your questions or vote for existing questions. This information can be found on the LED screens. All right, so without further ado, I'm pleased to hand this session to our panel moderator, Professor Tiffin, please.
Thanks so much, and thanks for some great talks to get us all thinking about this field as we get into the rest of the meeting, and to really help us frame our thinking around our participants, our populations, and the reasons why we're actually doing the work. So we've got some questions coming in. I'm going to take them in order of the votes, but I'm sure we'll manage to get to most of them. So here is one. Let me just get it active. Okay. Thanks for the talk. Would love to hear the speaker's view on how to ensure that precision medicine does not promote eugenic perspectives and genetic discrimination. So Julian, maybe we can start with you, as I think you probably were the originator of this question, but then we'll open the floor to the other panelists.
So eugenics literally means well-born. It's using the science of heredity to have offspring which are better in some way. So the eugenics programs of the 19th and 20th century were based on very early understandings of genetics, and they began as voluntary programs but moved to become involuntary, involving sterilisation and, in the German case, murder of people who were judged to be likely to have offspring that were either intellectually disabled, criminal, or poor. The hallmarks of the eugenics movement of the 19th and 20th century that people have in mind when they talk about eugenics is that it was involuntary, it was forced on people. It was aimed at a state vision in the Nazi case, but also in the US and European cases, of what a good society should be, and it was based on bad science. So how do you avoid it? You don't have a state vision of what society should be like, and you let people choose themselves. So modern clinical genetics is based on non-directive counselling and informed consent. So that's how you avoid eugenics. So you let people make their own decisions about whether to have children, how many children to have, and what kind of children. In fact, clinical genetics is eugenic. For example, it aims to give people the choice of whether to have a child with intellectual disability or not. That's the basis of Down syndrome screening. But the reason why it's not judged to be eugenic in the older sense is that it's not forced on people. People are supported whatever decision they make, and people with those conditions are supported in society. So the discrimination part, so again, Down syndrome is a good example. How do you ensure that offering Down syndrome screening doesn't disadvantage people with Down syndrome? You don't do it by banning Down syndrome screening. You do it by providing education and support to families who have a child or an adult with Down syndrome, provide education and an inclusive environment for people who have those conditions. So that's how you avoid discrimination.
Thank you. So we've got quite a few questions coming in, and here we have an interesting one that's been upvoted. Any insight into how long trust takes to build or rebuild, particularly for Indigenous communities, like the approximate time of community engagement, consultation. So yeah, absolutely for you. Thank you.
Is that working? Okay. So one thing we say about trust is that it's easy to lose, but takes longer to build. So that's why sometimes people advocate a sort of conservative relationship around being too risky with trust. And essentially, no, there's no time frame for how long it will take, but it depends on how much you're willing to give, right? So that might be the trade-off in relation to power sharing, for example, in New Zealand, which is perhaps not a model that other countries would necessarily intuitively want to follow. But I think, you know, the more you invest in it, the more you value those relationships, the more power you're willing to cede, the quicker you build trust. So it's kind of that question of what you put in is what you get out. And I think a lot of it comes down to, are you prepared to show epistemic humility, right? So are you prepared to say, rather than you come in and feed into my study that's going to work this way, am I happy to let go a little bit and let you as a different community with a different ways of knowing, different sources of knowledge, different decision-making processes, lead sometimes in terms of how this conversation goes?
Thank you very much. So now we've got a question that I think you can probably all answer from your different perspectives. So maybe this one I'm going to ask you each to give us more of a shorter soundbite. And this is a question on how genomics data will affect insurance. Will there be an ethical issue where insurance providers selectively deny those with genomic risk? And from just reading this, I think there's so many issues here because they involve trust, they involve how we manage ourselves ethically in the space, and of course also this idea of selection based on what our genomic profiles look like. So Michaela, maybe I can start with you.
The short answer will be yes, definitely. It will affect insurance. The question is then how, and that is for each society for us to figure out. And it is already done now. It does not need genomics. It just gets to a new level with genomics, with new interest, what might be done. But then insurance, to boot, is always about risk scores and how those risk scores feed into the decision making. And here is where then governance can come in and say, we can make adjustments.
Angela.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really significant risk. In the 5 years of research we've done in Singapore, this is the most significant and consistent concern. So for example, when we did the citizens' jury, one of their conditions was sharing data, for example, with the insurance companies, was that there would be a national moratorium or law banning genetic discrimination. So sometimes we need those kind of regulatory structures that aren't within genomics itself, but more externally. But you're right that even if we don't share our genomic data with insurance companies, you know, I had to renegotiate my insurance 2 years ago and they offered me some free genomic and genetic testing. And I was like, okay, well, I have 57 questions for you about what's happening with that data, which they weren't able to answer. So, yeah, I think it's a significant risk.
Thank you. Julian.
Joanne Nigau, I think you pronounce her name, disclosed to us that people have been discriminated here in Singapore. They've had, for example, BRCA testing, and it turns out negative, and their company still loads their premium, which is just dumb. They're actually at a lower than baseline risk of cancer. So I think there are some areas where there is just bad practice that needs to be ironed out, and that clearly is just bad practice. And then there are interesting ethical issues around, you know, how much should the government regulate this? And I believe the government are interested in extending the moratorium into legislation. And secondly, how much do we all want to pay for our insurance? And that's a social question about how inclusive insurance should be and how high the premiums should be. Because insurance companies will always make a profit. And if you know that you're at higher risk and you're able to take insurance, that means the cost of the premium will be distributed. So these aren't questions with obvious answers, and then that's why we'll need something like collective reflective equilibrium and consultation.
Thank you. And Michaela's got something to add. Yeah.
Indeed. I just got reminded of some conversations in Europe, in Denmark in particular, where a lot of those who participated in research on genomics and also biobank data were always promised better healthcare. Now, this is healthcare, general healthcare, free healthcare, but then the moment genomics comes in, the price tag comes in, then only insurance companies tend to pay for it or not. And then you have exactly the stratification and no longer access. So the original promise was felt by the participants is broken because we now look into healthcare that is not available to everybody anymore.
Thank you. So we have an upvoted question, which is, how can we progress in PRS scoring research without the accompanying stigmatization of populations of low intelligence and social skills? How are topics, and I think this is the essential question, how are topics for PRS prioritized? Who's deciding what's an acceptable topic to research, or what is an acceptable phenotype to be putting on the table for research? Let's frame it like that. So I don't know who would like to step in.
Well,
Yeah?
I can tell you how it is prioritised, and that's basically the way everything is prioritised about where the profit is. So it's prioritised according to, you know, which diseases are going to generate, you know, the greatest income. So the priorities are significant diseases, and so it should be. And those have the highest priority. How should it be prioritised? Should be prioritised in terms of the impact on people's well-being, in terms of how much that disposition contributes to their lives going better or worse. So this is what I call a welfarist perspective. So you've got either the disease-based or the commercial-based approach, and then the welfarist approach. And that may mean that, you know, something like polygenic scoring for educational potential, or academic cognitive potential, rises up in terms of priority, because it may be that how well we do at school contributes more to our well-being than, you know, a minor risk in terms of some disease. So that's how they may differ. In terms of the first part of the question, how do you avoid discrimination against people who have disadvantageous dispositions? The whole of the world is changing with this explosion of risk information that genomics is offering. So we're all going to have dispositions to diseases, we're going to have limitations in our cognitive or personality styles, so we're going to need a widespread education program that enables us to understand this new world of there isn't just normal and abnormal, there are just different dispositions to different things. And in many ways, this kind of revolution will be equalising, because we'll all find that we have maybe, you know, a higher disposition to psychoticism and psychopathic behaviour, or a higher disposition to altruism, or a higher disposition to diabetes. So I think that we need an education program to deal with this new revolution.
Thank you. Do you want to add?
Well, just to say that social systems already have layers and layers of discrimination and stigmatization, so that's not going to come from these technologies specifically. It's a question of how we use that knowledge within a system. And when we did research in Singapore, I mean, it's interesting that as individuals, Singaporeans were relatively keen to ensure their own embryos had an educational advantage. But when we talked about using genomic data to anticipate the future educational attainment of children that already exists, and they're imagining already their children who might then be disadvantaged if we started stratifying people. There was a lot of pushback to that scenario, so a lot of concern about inequality and stigma and discrimination in relation to their existing children. So I think, I mean, I like sort of Julian's approach around you've got to switch between asking individuals what they want, but then also asking them to think about the kind of society they want to live in and what sort of trade-offs they're prepared to make in that context.
Thank you. Michaela, do you want to chip in?
I can only say to agree to what was said before, and to add a new element to it is it differs from country to country. Again, we see that, and we can observe that in the different speeds, and again, learn from each other as we do in many instances. When it comes to the general learning of it, that's the positive end. When we look at the dark side of it, it would be the nationalism that we see of we're not sharing this Austrian, Singaporean, whatever data, because we want to use it first.
Great, thank you. So let's look. Oh, so following on, actually, thank you for the excellent talk. just curious, may I ask if we know why Singaporeans are more ready to use gene editing and embryo selection compared to other population cohorts in the US? But I think this talks, more widely to what are the drivers that engage members of the population. And how, I suppose as scientists, how should we be engaging with that, and ethicists, I don't know who.
Well, I think that there will, I think the Singaporeans should answer that, not me. But it may be that there is a higher weight given to academic achievement in Asian cultures. There's a greater tendency to harder work, to valuing these things. So I think you will see cultural differences. And sometimes people say ethics is just relative. It's just relative to different cultures, different times. And I think if you think that, there is no such thing as ethics, because the Nazis had a different ethic. It's not just that they were different, they were wrong. And that's why you have human rights. So, but what is true is that there can be a grey area in ethics, and you can give greater weight to certain things. And I think what you're going to see, excitingly, is kind of an Asian signature on these sorts of debates, and particularly with the rise of China. As I said, I predict they will have a much greater emphasis on academic performance, social cohesion, social relationships, antisocial behaviour I mentioned before. So I think that's going to add a lot of flavour to the debates.
Yeah, well, just like we talk about underrepresentation of non-European genomes in research, there's also an underrepresentation of non-Europeans in social science research around reasoning. So there's an excellent book called The Weirdest People in the Room, which makes the point, and weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and developed. Makes the point that most of the research we've done on psychology and how humans think and how they make decisions is based on early 20s and teenagers, university students in the United States or in Europe, right? It's a tiny category of people with a very small amount of kind of lived experience. And so part of, I think, the research in terms of public and patient engagement that's really important, and doing it in Singapore, the reason that's important is to try and diversify the people involved in our social science research as much as our genomic research.
Thank you. Michaela, do you want to also add something?
To add is, I'm sorry if I lose track, I just had a 20-hour flight behind me. What we see with the engagement activities is that we're happy to have the results, and they're valued and they're amplified. And that's important, but it needs to be continuously looked at it. So I could not agree more that social science research needs to be done always in parallel to things, and continuously to have, again, new data, to look at changes, to go with the population that you asked before, but also to ask the age groups of the 20 to 25 years repeatedly, whatever the study design says. But never forget that society is changing, people are changing, and have then different views.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time. I'm going to offer you each just like less than a minute to give a take-home that you really like everyone would to remember from the session. And I'm going to say to everyone whose questions I didn't get to, please find our speakers at tea or lunch and continue the conversation. So maybe, Michaela, do you want to start? And we'll just keep it brief as we watch our ticking clock here. Thank you.
I think I would like to exemplify the aspect of trust. Indeed, trust, and there's a beautiful saying that is, trust comes on foot and leaves on a rocket.
That's
okay,
lovely.
if we're saying
Angela.
sayings, all right, I've got one. So this is a saying from New Zealand in Māori, which is he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. And the idea is there, what matters most, it is the people, the people, the people. So it's keeping humans, I think, at the centre of all these debates.
Marvellous, Julian.
Singapore has a very mature regulatory environment. But I think there are enormous opportunities, especially here in Singapore and Asia, to chart your own way. And I can only say there are many, many more options than you realise, but you need some principled way of forming a policy. And in my view, that involves both properly sampling public values, and I just sketched one mechanism in my talk, but we're exploring several, And in addition to that, applying ethical theories to those results to come up with a defensible policy. And different countries may adopt different policies, but I think the future is radically open, and I hope that we don't just emulate what happens in Europe or in the US.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our great speakers.